everyone. Welcome to the Asian Hustle Network podcast. Today we have a very special guest. Her name is Darice Chang. Darice is a Taiwanese-American writer, artist, model, and activist from Minnesota. They believe in a compassionate and equitable society for all, regardless of gender expression, race, ethnicity, ability, or socio-economic status. They hosted the first English language LGBTQA plus radio show in Taiwan, Queerious, hosted on iCRT FM 100 from 2020 to 2021. They performed drag under the moniker Dan Dan Demolition and was featured in the Netflix docuseries Midnight Asia. They are passionate about authentic Asian and Asian American representation in media and entertainment. They also volunteer as social media director, international events ambassador, and English language liaison for Women's March Taiwan. They have previously aided in coordination and promotion for various causes, including animal rights, women's rights, human rights, and Taiwan's representation in the international space. Darice, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Super excited to be here.
We're really excited to have you as well. So let's get right into it. I'd love to learn about your upbringing. Where'd you grow up and what was it like growing up for you?
Okay, so I was actually born and raised in Minnesota. I was born in St. Paul, and then we moved out to Rochester, which is where the Mayo Clinic is. They do really good like cancer research. And so we were in Rochester till I was 8, and then we moved back up to the Twin Cities, and I grew up in a suburb called Savage, Minnesota, and ended up going to the University of Minnesota in the Twin Cities. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wow. And what was it like growing up in Minnesota and all of those different areas? I'm sure, we've had a lot of people in AHN who are from the Minnesota area, and it must have been an experience for them just like learning about their Asian identity and getting to know more about their roots and their cultural heritage. So I'd love to learn like what was your personal experience like growing up there?
So I was super lucky. I have a very traditional mother. So my first language was actually Chinese, because they asked around and everyone's like, it's okay, your kids are going to pick up English. You don't have to teach them. So my mom was like, okay, so we're going to teach them Chinese first. And so I only spoke Chinese until I went to preschool. And I remember going to preschool and being like, why does no one understand me? But by the time I was in kindergarten, like I had learned English, so it was fine. But I could speak and read and write Chinese before I could do English, and that was just something that really stuck with me. And then growing up bilingual, like you would go to Chinese school and stuff, but obviously you use English all the time, so that became my better language. And we also did a lot of just like traditional like Chinese, Taiwanese stuff growing up. Like both my sisters were in traditional dance. I was not gifted as a dancer growing up, so I did instruments, obviously piano, everyone does piano, or violin. And I also did guzheng, which is the long stringed instrument. I was in a traditional music Chinese ensemble, yeah, in Minnesota. And I also played changdi and zudi. So that's the bamboo flute. Yeah, I was actually mostly on flute and not as much on guzheng. And I also did drums and eventually learned taiko drums, and did traditional Chinese painting also. That was another thing that I did. Yeah, and we had a really strong connection with like the Chinese Taiwanese community where we were growing up. Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow. That is so amazing. I mean, I'm so glad to hear that you were so in touch with, your heritage. And I think I grew up a very similar way where my parents were just like, they never spoke English to me because they knew that me and my siblings were going to learn English in school anyway. So they only spoke Chinese, and we were pretty much only allowed to speak Chinese because they wouldn't be able to understand us if we spoke English. So I'm the exact same way. And they put us through Chinese school. They had us, write in like little booklets that they would buy from Chinatown and like just write in Chinese all day, every single day. So I grew up a very, very similar way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But then it's like, it's interesting because you grow up in a very, like the Midwest is very, very white.
Right.
And so like you just every time you go to school, you know you're different, but then you come back home and you're still like immersed in the culture. And I feel
Right.
like that was something really special about just like the way that I grew up. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's very much needed. I think going to school and like seeing that there is probably really little Asian people, it's refreshing to go back home and know that you're still in touch with your Asian roots and learn more about your Asian identity. So I love that you had that experience. Um, I know you have just like a wealth of experience and knowledge, and you've been in many, many different industries. I know that you were, dabbling in like real estate back then as a realtor assistant. You were
Oh, you looked at my LinkedIn.
Yeah, I did. I did. Like Brian and I, we were doing research on you. And like I remember when Brian had saw your post in Asian Hustle Network, and at that time we were, watching Midnight Asia. We can talk about that later on too. But we were
Okay,
like
cool.
looking at your LinkedIn, and you were, doing event coordination and a correspondent. And to us, like we're just, so amazed and just so in awe that you were dabbling in so many different things. But I know that, being a correspondent was like probably one of the bigger roles that you had that led you into, the industry of, producing and all of that. So how was that transition like? Just like, dabbling in so many different things and then realizing that you wanted to dive more into, being a producer and a writer and a publisher, journalist. So I want to learn about that as well.
Okay, cool. So basically, I've always been an avid and very interdisciplinary reader. So I read so much growing up. Like my mom really instilled in us the importance of education, and like during summer breaks, instead of taking us like Disney World or whatever, she would take us to the library. So I've always been a huge just like consumer of information, and I think that's really what led into the journalism. Also being in Taiwan and being multilingual, so I actually got my start as an interpreter for like international press conferences when I first came back this time. And so that's, I like met different journalists, and like I was interpreting for a political candidate at the time, and then I would see what they wrote and I would be like, I feel like I could probably do this too. And so then I started pitching, and then I started writing, and that's how I got into journalism. Yeah. And another thing I wanted to bring up is that I read this article called Why You Should Have at Least Two Careers by Kabir Segal, published in the Harvard Business Review very early on, like when I was in college, I think. And that had an enormous impact on me in my professional life, because I feel like a lot of times we feel like we have to be siloed into like one career track. But reading that article, I was like, wait, you can be creative, you can have your, professional life, and you can also do many things at the same time, which I was always into, because like, I don't know, I guess in school, like, you learn like 8 different subjects at the same time. And usually people are just like good at a couple of them. But I was one of those kids that was like good at like all of them, and I loved all of them. So I was like, I'm never going to be able to choose. Like, I never want to like give up one just so I can have the other. And think that sort of carries over into my professional life. Yeah.
That's so amazing. Yeah, that's very rare to have someone like all of the subjects, because you normally just like a few. But that is really amazing. And I absolutely agree. I think especially in the Asian culture, our families, they always tell us, just try to do this one profession, don't really dabble into different things. And that's normally just a few professions that we're pigeonholed into. Our parents normally tell us to become a doctor, or a lawyer, or an engineer, or a pharmacist, right? But I don't think they realize, a lot of our parents don't realize, and I think it's just like immigrant mentality too, that we are starting to realize that maybe these subjects and these industries don't really give us a lot of passion, right, or fulfillment. And we're trying to, kind of branch out and look into other things that really give us that sense of enjoyment, right, that sense of fulfillment. So I love that you, really honed into your perspective and like looked to see if there were any other things that you wanted to do, which is like so obvious, because you're just like, you're so experienced and so skilled in so many different areas.
Thank you.
Yeah. So what brought you back to Taiwan? Because you're located in Taiwan right now, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then,
So
yeah, you were initially in Minnesota, and I think you were in LA for a little bit.
yeah.
But what brought you back to Taiwan, and what was like that turning point? Like what made you really make that big decision to go back?
I think for me, it was I had done a gap year here after college. So, and obviously we would come back like for the holidays and stuff as a child. So like I was familiar with the environment, like I kind of knew how things worked. And then when I graduated, I was like, I don't know, like if I want to do a master's. That was also during the economic downturn in the US. So the job market was not great. And I initially actually wanted to go to Japan because I majored in Japanese. That was one of my majors. But that was the same year as the Tohoku earthquake. So we decided it was not a good idea to do that. And since I had family here, I was like, okay, we'll just go to Taiwan for a year, experience for a while and then come back to the US and like find a real job and whatever. So that's what I did. And I came out here and I tried teaching English because that's what everyone does. I was not great at it. But it turns out I had the language skills to do translation, which I had much more enthusiasm for. So I ended up doing translation and eventually got into interpretation, which is when you're speaking and interpreting. Yeah, and then it turns out I can also do simultaneous interpretation. So that's like conference interpretation, where you talk at the same time as somebody else, except for in a different language. So yeah, that's what I was doing while I was here, and I loved it, and it was super fun, and I just loved Taipei. And then after a year, I was like, okay, time to go back to the US. So we went back, and then I had an opportunity in Los Angeles that was the real estate job. So I moved out there and was working for a family friend for a while as a real estate assistant. And it wasn't really for me. So I ended up looking for other jobs. I got hired as a assistant into a logistics company. Also, it was not for me. And then I got headhunted actually into a Japanese company. Um, and it's really interesting because actually Japanese companies always use an agency whenever they hire. So, and they'll scrub like, because I knew Japanese on Indeed, like I was just looking for jobs. And so they'll scrub the resumes on there and look for people who speak Japanese to work at Japanese companies. So this headhunter found me, and then they do the pre-interviews and are like, what are you looking for? What do you want? Blah, blah, blah. And so she got me like 3 different interviews, and then 2 of them liked me, and I just chose one of them. Yeah, and that's how I ended up working in food and beverage distribution. I guess we were technically an import-export company, and my division focused on non-food. So my specialty was actually in like handmade Japanese knives and like all of the accoutrements that you need that are not food that you would use in like a restaurant. So that was super cool. While I was out in LA. Yeah. So you get to meet like all these different chefs, and like all the top restaurants basically came to our company.
Oh,
So
wow, that's so
yeah.
amazing. I mean, going back and forth from, the States to Taiwan, um, how was that like for you? Because for me personally, my parents are from Hong Kong, and so sometimes I would go back to Hong Kong. Um, but a lot of, let's say, American-born Asians, right? We tend to have this feeling where like we don't feel American enough when we're in America, right? Because we're always going to be seen as like an outsider. We're
Mhm.
always going to, look the way that we do, and a lot of the times, we've seen a lot of that happen in the last couple of years in the US, where a lot of Asians are going through racist attacks, but then when I go back to Hong Kong or Asia, I also feel a little bit out of place because they can tell that I'm not actually from there. And they can just automatically see that, like just by the way I dressed or the way
Mhm.
I speak, they can automatically tell. So what was that experience for you? Like just going back and forth, and did that have any effect on, just finding your Asian identity when you were going back and forth from the States to Taiwan?
I feel like because I've always had a very solid Asian identity. Like I know like in the States, like you don't see Asian representation in mainstream media as much when we were growing up, but like we have Hong Kong film, and like we have like Taiwan used to be huge in like dramas and stuff. And so I always looked to that for my Asian identity. And then I think growing up in the Midwest, you do have a very strong sense of being American just because it's like the heartland. So that's something that you can never take away from me. Like that's just where I grew up, and that's how I grew up. So I guess I never really had um any sort of like identity crisis that way, but you do get looked at differently. Like I remember my first boyfriend, this is so funny. So my family on my grandfather's side is actually from Sichuan. And the first time that we went out on a date with his mom, because I was meeting his parents, he's like, "Do you want to go to a Szechuan restaurant?" And I was like, "What's a Szechuan?" And then it turns out it's like that's how they pronounce Sichuan in American. And I was like, oh my gosh, like I never realized that like this is the lens that you view my culture through, just because I was so in it all the time.
Yeah.
And I think moving out to Los Angeles, which has a much larger Asian population, was also really interesting because that brought me actually closer to my Asian American identity. Whereas before it was sort of like Asian and American, and then LA is sort of where it came together because there's so much of that going on. And I was very lucky to be actually at a Japanese company because a lot of them are like Nisei or like however many generations removed, and you get to see how like the Asian American identity has progressed, and LA being such a locus of culture for that was really interesting. So I really appreciated that time there and connecting with the people there. Yeah. I think.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think LA and SF are very, very diverse, San Francisco. And so Brian is from Los Angeles and I'm from San Francisco. And so the area that I grew up in San Francisco is, I would say it's like 90% Asian. And then Brian is the same way. Where he grew up, it's called 626. It's like
yeah, that's where I first moved to when I moved to LA. I was in Monterey Park, and it's like you don't even need English.
Yeah, exactly. You don't even need English. Like you can definitely survive if you don't even know English. And we always talk about how the areas that we grew up in San Francisco and LA, like it was hard for us to picture us as a minority unless we went out of California, because we were just stuck in our bubble all the time, you know, and like Brian just was like in 66 and everything was just available to you if you were an immigrant. And there's just so many Asian restaurants, so many, you know, resources for Asian immigrants. You really didn't know that you were a minority. In the same way as I was in San Francisco, like when I traveled outside of California, that's when I really found out like, oh, I am a minority. Like there's not a lot of Asians out here. So it's just interesting perspective and on like different locations and everything like that.
Yeah, definitely. Like when I was in LA, I never really felt like a minority because like I was in the 626 and then I worked at a Japanese company, which was like 90% Japanese. So it's just like, it was sort of like living in basically in just like Asian America. So
yeah,
like,
absolutely.
it was great.
Yeah. So tell me about the radio show Queerious. How long have you been doing Queerious, and what are the specific topics that you talk about on the show, and what is the message that you are, you know, looking to portray to your audience on that show?
I think for me, well, the show it was actually a music show, so most of the time we're playing music, and so my focus was obviously on LGBTQ plus and ally musicians. So most of the songs we were playing were like we played Lil Nas X, and a lot of just like classic gay artists, I guess, like Britney Spears. I mean, she's not gay, but she's an icon, and like Madonna and stuff like that. And it was mostly about just like representing. So, because I identify as non-binary and I'm queer, and there just had never been a radio show in Taiwan that centered on that. And I was really lucky that our radio manager helped to push that through. And I was able to do the show and have that representation for a little bit. And so every week we would just talk about like, hey, what's going on the scene? What new music is there? Because it is like a music centered show, and mostly just like top hits. So yeah, it was basically just like having that space for people to see themselves being represented on like the airwaves and stuff.
Yeah, and that's so important, you know, to have that platform and create that safe space to build representation. And that's, you know, very similar and exactly the same thing that we're trying to do with Asian Hustle Network as well. And it doesn't have to be Asians, but it could be, you know, other groups, other minorities, other, you know, communities that you're trying to uplift and really amplify. And you're really providing that platform for the LGBTQA plus community to, you know, hear and see people who look like them and sound like them. And that's exactly what we're trying to do with Asian Hustle Network as well. So I commend you for, creating that platform. And it makes you think, like, why hasn't anyone else done this before too, right? And you mentioned that Queerious was the first radio show catered towards the LGBTQA plus community in Taiwan. And Asian Hustle Network was going through a very similar route as well, where there were a lot of Asian communities, but not a lot of Asian communities that were catered towards entrepreneurs and small business owners. And that's so important for us because we have to support each other and support our businesses. And we've seen such a decline with, Asian businesses during the pandemic, and it just like made us really think, like, why isn't there anything like this out there? But I love that you were just like pioneering that space for the LGBTQ plus QA plus community. So really commend you for that.
Thank you. Yeah. And I really love the AHN community as well. I think I got into it right at the beginning of the pandemic, and it was really uplifting to see so many people coming together to help each other out. Like when, people were like fundraising for PPE and things like that. And it was just really, it's like a really, really good, positive community. And I'm so glad that you guys created this for everyone.
Oh, that's so sweet of you, Darice. No, like I was going back to the old posts in Asian Hustle Network, and like for listeners, Darice like joined a long time ago, and I could see like very old posts from back then before the pandemic that she was posting. And a lot of people were actually, giving shout outs to Darice and saying like, hey, I saw you on Midnight Asia. And it's just so incredible to have connected with Darice through this platform. So tell us, Darice, tell us about Midnight Asia. Brian and I, we watched it on Netflix, and I was so in love with it because I just love going back to Asia and learning not only about my ethnicity, but other Asian ethnicities as well, just like the food, the culture, the nightlife. And I was just so in love with the series. So tell us how this opportunity of Midnight Asia came upon you and what the whole process looked like.
Okay, so basically like the production network in Taiwan is really small for international media. So we basically all know each other. And so I knew the producer that was helping with the show, Betty, and she came to me initially when they were just like doing research for the show. She was like, hey, do you know anything about like late night in Taipei? And I was like, okay, like these are the clubs, there's drag shows, there's this, there's that. And so I sent her a bunch of contacts and information, and then she went out and did her research. And then she came back to me later and she's like, so I heard you're a drag king. And I hadn't told her this at all. So she found this out on her own. And at the time I was still like, I would consider myself like a baby king. So I was only performing for like a year and a half. I definitely wasn't at the level that I wanted to be at yet. But I was
can I know how you also got into drag too? Like how it all started?
It started with just like drag salons. So they're like private intimate gatherings of people who are interested in performing drag. So our drag granddaddy, as we call them, is Sky Grimm, and they had been a drag king, I guess, on the scene for a while. They weren't really performing, but they would show up at queer parties like dressed up with like glitter and sparkles and makeup and everything, and just like drag kinging. And so they wanted to foster a community of other people who were willing to perform and stuff, because the drag queen community in Taiwan has been around for a while, maybe 20 years at this point. But there wasn't really a drag king community for the AFAB, or assigned female at birth, community. So they held a drag salon at their house and people came over. I went over, we all did makeup together, we took pictures, we like were talking about what we want to do, our drag personas, because you can sort of think of like like when you have a drag queen, right? Like they have like a persona. It's like, like
Right.
Alaska, this is what she does, or like Trixie Mattel, like they have their like thing. So everyone was coming up with like, okay, like who do I want my drag persona to be? And that's when I came up with Dan Dan Demolition, because I was like, I really want to just sort of like smash through what everyone thinks of when they think of, for example, a non-binary person, or different gender norms and things like that. So that's where the demolition part of it came from. And then Dan Dan is actually my Chinese name. It's my nickname in Chinese, actually. Yeah. And in Japanese, it's also like a very dramatic sound effect. So if you read manga and you see like Dan, it means like a big presence. And that's what I wanted to create for my drag persona. So that's how that came about. And then through that, we got invited to different performances, and we also hold our own performances. So like one of them had like a boat party, and I performed at a fundraiser for like a animal charity. And yeah, that's sort of how I got my start. Yeah.
Wow, that is so amazing. It's really intriguing and just like enlightening just hearing about how you got started, because you definitely, talked about that during Midnight Asia, and just like learning about your experiences is so refreshing. So how did the Midnight Asia production team kind of fall on your lap, and how did you get, casted onto the show?
I think they were just looking for interesting stories. And so drag kings are sort of they're not necessarily newer, but they're getting more popular. So Betty asked me if I wanted to be on the show, and I was like, yes, definitely. Like, representation matters. So then we met with the producer, and we had pre-interviews. There was me and also Yolanda, who is my drag guardian on the show. And so they interviewed us about like our experiences, nightlife in Asia, et cetera, et cetera. And then after that, they were like, okay, like we want you on the show. And I was like, okay, cool. And then COVID hit and everything got delayed. And after, luckily, Taiwan did a super good job. Like we never had a huge outbreak or anything. So we were actually able to film after maybe like a half-year delay. And they ended up working with a local producer, because at the time our borders are actually still closed, mostly closed. And so they couldn't fly in the original director, and they worked with a local director to film the show. Yeah.
Wow, that is so amazing. I mean, that whole experience must have been so, life-changing for you. And it's amazing. When Brian and I we were watching it, we were just so inspired. How has your life kind of changed? Has your life changed at all ever since Midnight Asia? And have you been have you just experienced any changes or learned something about yourself after the production of Midnight Asia, or just like went through any very enlightening experiences for yourself?
I think um I think I've really appreciated the fact that I've had this opportunity, and the representation part of it actually has been a huge part, because I've had messages from like people all over the world will message me on my Instagram and be like, oh my gosh, I saw you on Midnight Asia, and like thank you so much for representing our community. And it'll be people from like Brazil or like Ireland or something like I've never been to before, and they're just super happy to see someone who's AFAB and non-binary being represented on such a major streaming platform. Yeah. And also I think Asians in the queer space as well. Like I've been added to a bunch of like drag kinging groups specifically for Asians, and then just networking with different people who are in the space and interested in the same things, and trying to push that representation forward. Yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Representation matters so much, and I think that for us to have more of us being represented on screen, that will, create a domino effect for our future generations, right? And if we can't put ourselves on screen, our younger generations won't be able to, look to that and say like, that is possible. I can be on TV too if I am XYZ, right? And especially in the queer space for Asians, we still don't see a lot of that, right? And we're still kind of building up that representation, because we're still seeing a lot of inequity within that space, like let alone Asians, but also in the queer space. Like we're still trying to build up that representation. So just wanted to thank you for doing what you're doing and creating that space for all of us, and for people who are queer as well.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. So after all of these experiences, and after just going through what you're trying to figure out, like who you want to become, and what you were trying to do after all of these experiences, I know you have dabbled in so many things. What do you think has been like the hardest thing for you? I'm sure you go through a lot of peaks and valleys, right? We all have our highs, our lows. But was there a time where you really like felt really down? For a lot of entrepreneurs and small business owners and producers and writers, people who are just, hustling in their own rights, we oftentimes have very, very, sad times where, we look back and we think to ourselves, like, can we really do this? Am I really equipped to become an entrepreneur? Have you ever went through those times? And if so, how did you overcome them?
I think definitely, yeah. Mm, huh. I'm trying to think about how to phrase it. It's like sometimes you just feel like there's no like sometimes you feel like I've tried so hard and I've given everything and like
Right.
things still are not the way that I want them to be, or like I still haven't gotten to where I want to be yet. And you really, really, really want to just like give up and just be like, okay, maybe I'll just like get a day job or whatever. Um, but I think the thing that's pushed me through is actually this research paper that shows that people who succeed, the only thing they have in common is perseverance. Like it doesn't matter how smart you are, it doesn't matter how much money you start out with, it doesn't matter anything. The only thing that matters is that you don't give up. And that's been the thing that's kept pushing me forward, because it's like as long as I don't give up, like you will succeed. Like according to science, that is the thing. And so yeah, that's what's kept me going. And I think also like having a purpose too, right? Like with Netflix and performance and representation, I'm just like, I never really realized how much bravery it took to be able to just put yourself out there until you start doing it. And I feel like if I have that characteristic, I should be exhibiting it and like doing my best to help the community or to like represent and just be myself as much as possible. So every time I like get scared or whatever, or I start to doubt myself, like that's what I go back to. And the same thing, I guess, in like my regular freelancing life. Freelancing is very difficult. And yeah, it's the same thing. It's like, hey, like I know other freelancers and they also have hard times. And so like you have a community and you just like sometimes you're like, oh man, this client, they haven't paid me in like 2 months and they keep dragging, or like, this case is really difficult and whatever. Like you have a community that you go back to and that you can help support each other. And I think that's really important. Yeah. So
Yeah.
those are like the things that really get me through the super difficult times.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Community is so important. And I think oftentimes we forget about what has really helped us get to the finish line, right? And oftentimes that is community. Because I do see sometimes, people will say, I made it on my own, or, I'm self-made. But that's not realistic at all, because if you really did make it, there were people, a community, your family, your friends, whoever, they were there to support you, and I think we have this this pride where a lot of us, we want to, boast about, oh, I'm self-made, or I did everything on my own. But the reality is that you most likely had someone there to help you get to that level, right? And today, like, it usually is community, and community is the one that who really pushes us forward. And I love that you are so well immersed in community, and the fact that you're, talking a lot about community is so important, because for Asian Hustle Network, what we're all about, community. And to see everyone just like support each other and amplify each other and uplift each other, that goes such a long way.
Definitely, yeah. Like with the drag community with AHN, like
Mhm.
I feel like a lot of the times we strive for perfection, and so it can be difficult to like reach out to others for help. But like all of us have our own struggles, and there's going to be someone out there who has been through what you've been through or has a resource that you could use right now. So really just like lean into that, because you have that resource, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I
Mhm.
have a fun question for you. I don't know if you would have an answer, but were there any like fun stories from recording on Midnight Asia that you can share with the audience?
I think the most fun one. Okay, so they told me super last minute. They were like, okay, so like we want to do a scene with you and your friends, just like drinking at a bar. Like, do you have any friends that you can call over? And I was like, oh my God, crap. Because like all my friends are hustlers and like all of them are super busy. So I start texting like every single person I know. I'm like, hey, are you doing anything right now? Like, we are filming for Netflix. Like, I need you to come through. And my friend Ivan actually like came through. He was like, yes, I have time right now. Like, I will show up. And he showed up in like the best way. Cause like I'm super big on sustainability and like ethical fashion and everything. And he shows up in this jacket by Storywear, which is this like social entrepreneur program in Taiwan that empowers women who are homebound due to children with like developmental disabilities. And it's like a zero waste fashion brand. And I'm just like, Evan, you're so on point right now. Like, I love this. I love you so much. And he's just like the best guy too. He's super humble, but he used to be at the Max Planck Institute. Like, he has a PhD in physics and is like an artist and teaches at like one of the top universities in the country. And he's just like, yeah, I'll come through.
Oh my
So
gosh.
that was the best. Yeah.
I'm just
He's
picturing
only,
Evan like showing up in the most like extravagant way as possible.
yeah, he came through. I'm just like, oh my gosh, like, thank you. I have one friend. And then like we went to the bar and there were other people there I knew too. So I was like, okay, good. Like, whew, this worked out. Otherwise, I'm just like, like you guys got to give me like a month advance, like 2 months advance if you want people to like do the thing. So
That's amazing.
yeah.
I'm glad you found someone. I would be freaking out too if they like only gave me a set amount of time to find someone.
Yeah, literally like the day of, we were like halfway through filming. They're like, hey, let's do this scene. And I'm like, huh? Okay. Text.
Oh,
Like, who is free
well,
right this second?
you pulled through. You pulled through, Darice.
Yeah.
So, Darice, how do you normally manage your mental health? And just like, what is your day-to-day routine like? Because, you know, for a lot of us as entrepreneurs and hustlers, we, a lot of the times we tend to forget to take care of ourselves too. And I'm just curious about, you know, how you normally, you know, find solitude within yourself and just like manage your mental health on a day-to-day basis.
I meditate a lot. I have a daily meditation that I do at 6 in the morning every day. And it's just like a half hour of like blessings and like positivity, which is really helpful. And then I'll do the same thing at 1 p.m. if I have time. If I don't have meetings and stuff, I'll do another round. And then I have one before bed, also for a half hour. So it's just like a wind down before going to bed. And that's what I do for meditation. I also maintain like a healthy diet. I'm vegan, so that helps a lot. And just trying to stay with the whole food diet when I can. I actually cook like 50% of my own food or more sometimes, just because it's healthier than eating out in Taiwan, especially. Like, we do have healthy options, but they do tend to be a little pricier, and I like making my own food. So, because I know exactly what goes in it. So I do that. And I exercise when I can. My exercise regime is not great right now, but I do what I can. Yeah. And I do also see like what's it called? Like a psychiatrist for mental health. Because I was diagnosed with bipolar a while ago, and like I think depression and anxiety. So I do see a doctor for that. And I have some medications that I take to help manage that. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm so glad that you were, you know, able to, you know, seek help because especially in the Asian community where it's like there's such a big stigma with seeking mental health services.
Mm-hmm.
But it's such a normal thing, you know, even if you don't feel like you need help. I think it's really important for us to seek help, either
Mm-hmm.
with a therapist or a psychiatrist, because they can help you just organize your day-to-day thoughts and just like kind of
Mm-hmm.
peel off the layers. And I personally feel like it's so healthy for us to just learn more and understand ourselves a lot better in ways that we wouldn't be able to normally understand ourselves if it wasn't for, you know, help from a psychiatrist or a therapist. So I'm so glad that you kind of like got the routine down and, you know, meditating for 3 times a day. That is super impressive. Like, I feel like for a lot of people who hustle on a day-to-day basis, like we never find the time to do that, but to actually just like find the time and make time to meditate for 3 times a day, that is extremely impressive. Like
Yeah.
kudos
I
to
mean, I
you.
don't always make all three. Like sometimes I only do one.
Yeah,
But it's like I have it in my calendar for all three. So
right.
that like if I have the time, I'll be like, okay, we're gonna do it. And
Yeah.
then, but then obviously sometimes you have meetings or it's busy or something. Yeah. But I think just like trying our best. And also I did want to say I'm really grateful to my dad because I did have some mental health issues in high school and he encouraged me actually to go to therapy, which was really helpful. And then that's how I knew like later in life when I was having other issues that I was like, hey, this isn't normal and I need to seek help. So yeah, I think
Yeah, I
I'm
love
really,
that.
really blessed in that way.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I love that so much because a lot of Asian parents, they don't even, know a lot about mental health. And I don't
Mhm.
blame them either because back then there was not a lot of research or,
Mhm.
analysis on mental health. So it's hard for them to understand what it even is to begin with. But I'm glad your dad kind of like opened that conversation for you. So it's easier for you to really understand it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah,
And I think now there's a lot more resources in
right,
like the like for example Chinese language.
right.
Like I found some resources for like explaining bipolar or like manic depression and things like that
Yeah,
in like Chinese, and they have like comics and things because like people are working on it. And I find that it's helpful to have like if you have Asian parents who they can't read the English,
right.
then you can give it to them in the original language and that helps to bridge that gap.
Yeah, yeah, I love that so much. It's like hard to like I don't even know how to translate that to my parents.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Darice, what is next for you? Like what are your goals going to be for, let's say, the next 5 years? And what's really next on the horizon for you?
Ooh, I'm not one of those 5-year people. I used to be.
It could be it
Um,
could be
and
10.
yeah, and it like doesn't really like in Chinese we say like 规划追不上 or whatever 变化. Yeah, so like your plan can never keep up with the changes that happen, and I have
Yeah,
definitely found that to be true. So like I guess my 5-year plan would be to star in more things. There's like a sustainable travel show I want to do. Someone asked me for a vegan cooking show a while back, so I did put together a proposal, and I have to shop it around more and see who wants to fund it. Um, I want to maybe try acting because when we were doing the Netflix filming, actually, the director was looking at the footage. She's like, "You should try acting. You would be a really good actor." And I'm like, "Okay." Like I've thought about it tertiarily because like I've always been creative and I enjoy expressing like myself through body and storytelling and everything. And so that's maybe something that I want to try out. Yeah. And then getting back into music, actually. The reason I started doing drag was actually to learn more performative art before I wanted to create music. Because I guess I've always been just like an artist at heart, and that's just something that I've always wanted to do. Yeah, is to
I
create
love
like
it.
music performance.
Yeah, amazing. Well, I can't wait to see more films with you in it, with you being, with you acting in it. And so can't wait to see all of those good news come to fruition.
Thank you.
So, Darice, where can our listeners find out more about you online?
So I'm on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn. I also have a small website. And I'll drop you all the links so you can follow me. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. I
Mhm.
will be sure to add all of that in the show notes. But that was amazing episode, Darice. It was awesome hearing about your story. I just want to thank you so much for being on our show.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And I'm so excited to be sharing this with the world.
Thank you, Darice. All right. Bye.
Bye.